to the speakers that have spoken. After the teachers have spoken, we will call the system leaders to reflect and contribute towards our thinking and help solve for some of the issues that have been raised by these teachers in one way or the other. And I think a lot of good can come from that. And so I know that we have system leaders from around the world on this call as well, including a couple of ministers of education, who I'm thankful to for joining this call. I should also at this stage say that this entire call is on the record. So whatever you say and whatever's in the chat box is on the record. You know, there are some journalists also on the call who may decide to pick some elements of these things, of these discussions, and reproduce them elsewhere. And if so, they may reach out to you, or they may not. But you should just be aware that everything is on the record. Now, two small housekeeping points. One is that a lot of us are very social media friendly, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Please use the hashtag EdChat, EDCHAT, across the platforms. And the second thing is, what I'm trying to encourage everyone is for everyone to sign up to the dedicated LinkedIn page and group that we've created. And if you scroll up this chat, on this chat facility over here, you'll see in caps the link to that LinkedIn group if you haven't already done so. It's where that we want to keep the conversation going when we don't have these Zoom calls. And we have some plans to do things there as well. Lastly, I want to thank friends. And if you look at the 147 odd of you who have signed in today, a large proportion of you are from India and from Nigeria. And that's not by accident. We have some great friends who have cascaded information about this call to their networks, whether it's Teach for Nigeria, whether it's Center, and other friends. So I want to thank all the teachers from those two networks in particular for joining in. Without further ado, I want to introduce my co-conspirator, Senator Esteban Bullrich in Argentina. Senator Bullrich has been an education advocate for most of his life and actually served as the Minister of Education for Argentina. Prior to that, he was the Education Minister for the city of Buenos Aires. And since his government since his political party are not in office, he now serves in the Senate and leads on all education issues and other such matters in the Senate. He remains an ardent advocate and a champion for education, and that's why I'm proud to call him my friend. Esteban, over to you to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Vikas. I'm not the champion. I'm a runner-up. You are the champion. I'm trying to learn. Thanks everyone for being here. As Vikas said, we're going to start with David Edwards. David is the president of Education International, the Union for International Teachers, and we thought it would be a good kickoff for this meeting to hear from him, his views and his global view of what's going on through this crisis and what we can learn from it, and then from there get going the whole discussion. So David, up to you, and again thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll add my thanks to the two co-conspirators. They do lots of reputational benefit to me all the time, so it's fantastic to be with them. And I'm of the view always that the smartest person in the room is always the room. So I look forward to hearing from all of you. So what I'd like to do is just sort of frame out a few things, the way in which Education International is thinking about this and what we're hearing. We have, so first, Education International, World Federation of Teachers, Unions, and Organizations, 175 countries, 32 million teachers, 400 organizations. Our executive asked us to, executive board, to survey member organizations. So we surveyed, put out a survey. It was about, we got responses that will cover about, in terms of elected leaders, approximately 15 million teachers. So those are 103 organizations and countries that they have their own processes for filling that out. And what we were really looking at was trying to figure out what's been the impact on teachers, on their communities and on their schools, and what are teachers and their organizations doing. Yeah. So we have just received that. I'd hoped to have this report ready to actually launch, but Vika, sorry, we're still writing and slicing and translating, and as you would have with lots of other different surveys, people are questioning certain findings, and they would like, so we have some of that negotiating going on. But it's very interesting. One of the things I think that you can say is that just in the same way as we're seeing wide variation across the continuum of what the COVID crisis has meant versus whether you're in a country that's just entering or whether you're one that's potentially, I see Denmark's there and others that are trying to figure out what back to school looks like and what the exit strategy would be. We wanted to hear sort of what our members, what teachers were saying in terms of what good practice was looking like, what they were doing, and we kind of break it into sort of three things that kind of came out. I mean, it's tools, time, and trust. Yeah. So those are sort of three main themes, and what the organizations and what the teacher leaders were telling us, and I'm sure you can go much deeper into some of the examples in classrooms, but in those places where the organizations respond that the government is listening to and engaging with the teaching profession in terms of finding solutions and support, tend to be high trust, high dialogue with reinforced respect for professional autonomy. We found across countries and across member organizations, those that report that level of governments listening, engaging, tend to be the ones where tech has actually been provided to them. So these are not just trying to share a family laptop or iPad or something, that the teachers and the students actually have tech provided to them as part of their educational resources. That's part of that. It's not necessarily to just try to find and pull together. The other thing that we found, and this, I think many of you will probably touch on this too, is that the countries where institutionalized CLPD, continuous learning and professional development, was in place are faring a lot better. And they're not trying to have to catch up. So a lot of member organizations and teacher leaders in countries where, all of a sudden you're online, sink or swim, it's created a lot of tension. Another issue that you no shock that we're following and concerned quite a lot about is the issue of the continuation of terms and conditions. So again, in those sort of high trust, high dialogue countries, teachers have an assurance that they are going to be paid. They're not going to be furloughed, let go, to pay for something. Number 4, comprehensive, clear, and coherent policy. So it's not just a country, a ministry is just sort of making it up as they go, but there were actually in place sort of emergency response or plans for this. So decisions, procurement, issues around attendance, around exams, around all these different kinds of things was part of a plan, or at least is now becoming part of a plan. And the last one talks a lot about in terms of the conditions, the pedagogical conditions. So respondents were telling us that in many countries, and not many countries, in some countries where we're seeing good dialogue, good trust, the relationship between teacher and student is facilitated and supported. So you have multi-directional communication happening between teachers and students. So you wouldn't be surprised to find out the teachers' organizations and leaders in countries feel that when they report that they feel their governments aren't listening or blocking their attempts to input or to help inform decision makings, those are the ones where tech is up to the individual teacher or student. There's no CLPD. It's go on YouTube, go on whatever platform. there isn't that assurance of continuation. In fact, there's a lot of uncertainty and precarity, particularly for teachers in the private sector, which we're very concerned about. We've been finding have been disproportionately affected in terms of being furloughed and let go. Also, in early childhood education has been really, really hard hit, and the education support personnel also. We've also seen in those countries competition instead of collaboration, and I would say is a sort of a descriptive feature. That means that you have various platforms, various tech competing for teachers' attention, for students' attention, no sort of clear directives from the ministry, everyone's just out for themselves, fragmented, just in all sorts of instead of a thousand blossoms blooming, you have sort of 1,000 mutated viruses morphing. And instead of that multi-directional sort of relationship between student and teacher, what you see is a much more, I guess you would, more non-interactive, sort of unidirectional. I mean, in some cases, it's just sort of content delivery pared down, where they're taping lectures and putting them up there, or it's a television channel. And that seems to be a problem that our members are talking about a lot. So that was just to kind of get you up. Our survey will actually be out within the next week or so. We're trying to get it translated, and like I said, we're trying to look at a lot of different things. We have cases inside as well. So you have, I won't mention the provinces in Canada that are having issues where, you know, right now there's sort of the contract is being suspended, or the country in Africa where teachers are not going to be paid for the next 4 months so that they can cover the costs. But you can imagine our position on those. But we'll be doing more deeper dives into that, and I hope to share then further information around the survey later. My head of research at EI, Martin Henry, is on this call too. So if I have to drop off and jump on an executive board call, he can answer any questions you have too later. So thank you very much.
David, thanks. First, I will suggest or ask anyone that wants to ask questions to just start posting those questions on the chat window so we can follow them. And I have a couple of questions myself. The first one would be, you talked about some of the bad examples. Can you mention a couple of the good examples of coordination? Because I see that same problem here of the lack in Argentina of the lack of coordination of platforms and even media use, right? From within different governments, we have a federal country. Each province, each of the 24 provinces can choose each platform, and there is no coordination among them so far. Do you have good examples on that coordination working even across borders?
Yeah. So I have to watch here, because my members are saying, you know, it's not so great. So in my world, you have to be careful, because you overstate how good things are, you know, and then there's nothing to discuss. But yeah, I mean, I think we've seen some good examples. We know that I'll start in Africa. We know that in Cameroon, our members were telling us that they're actually working on the selection of materials and working with the curriculum and trying to figure out what should be synchronous and what should be asynchronous, and which platforms and what sort of quality assurance you want to put in place there. You know, we find that you know, I know that the Argentine, you're feeling the lack of coordination on the Argentine side, but if I look around Latin America, Uruguay comes out in terms of the one that seems to be the best case around already having the infrastructure, having the resources, all those checklists that I made earlier on in terms of getting telecommunications, getting the health ministry, getting the education ministry, getting that sort of integrated approach. I actually think it's interesting in Argentina that you guys have with the Escuelas Abiertas, the Paca Paca, and you have the TV channel that's aligning right with the teacher. I think what I'd say in that case is that the preparation for this, you know, a lot of what we're hearing from the teachers in Argentina was that, and maybe you have them online, they can tell you, they didn't feel trained in order to do this. They didn't have not all of them felt that it is strong about being able to use it. You know, we have stories in across Europe where Norway, you know, the Teachers Association, teachers unions are at the table looking right now at what are the conditions for going back, right? So looking at, you know, who gets vaccinated, who gets tested, what are the social distancing aspects of this, what does good occupational health and safety look like, you know, how are we going to deal with this issue about qualifications and testing and assessment and curriculum, and what about all these teacher trainees who were waiting to do their practicum and what happens to them now. So there's a comprehensive plan that the Norwegians are doing right now that I think is quite interesting. But I always joke, I don't know if Norwegians are on the phone, but it's when you're in Valhalla, it's easier to do some things than other places when you're not quite there. So yeah, we have some good stories. We also have stories of teachers organizations taking the lead. We have Share My Lesson that the American Federation of Teachers is made available. I think there's Share My Lesson Australia and others, maybe some of you know. And many of you are part of networks that are working in different ways to try to help support and put forward solutions. And I think all of that is great when it's done in a collaborative way. I really think the importance of that plan, that national plan, and people understanding what their roles are and how it's going to be resourced and how it's going to be rolled out and what the expectations are in terms of the communication with parents is also something. We've had teachers tell us that we don't even know what to tell parents because we don't know, but in many ways it's the teachers that are actually the frontline communicators as well, because school leaders themselves don't necessarily always have the relationship with parents. But there are good stories, and we'll have more of those as we go.
That leads me to my second question, and taking also a question from Raya. What is the feedback from parents, if you have any, of the whole situation, and do you see that teacher-parent relation changing through this? I can tell you, with 5 kids in a shutdown, I turn to value teachers much more now. But what is the feedback from parents overall?
And don't forget, you have a daughter that's a teacher now, Esteban.
Yeah.
So you've joined our ranks.
She's helping us though.
She's good. Well, you have a teacher in the house.
There you go.
We went through this. There were memes, right? There was sort of this process of memes where we were all sort of sending ourselves hearing parents going, "Oh my gosh, how do you do this? How do we structure this? How do you keep these little people engaged and constantly? This is really a lot of mind work. This is so exhausting." So there was, at the early stages, there were a lot of pieces that were coming into us where we were trying to sort of help with FAQs for parents, so that our member organizations could put things up and share with parents when their teachers, their members were getting asked. Because I don't think the idea is that you want to convert the home. You don't want to academicize the home. I think that's the first thing that we've been sort of saying as a guidance for parents. Some places there's parent-teacher organizations, and they have conversations around the guidelines and how you kind of balance, the amount of time that's given to teaching versus playing versus being outside versus going on a bear hunt in your neighborhood or something like that. We've been pretty much overwhelmed by the support that parents have been, the status of teachers, the respect for teachers has been fantastic. I think that it depends on the jurisdiction, because we also hear parents that are saying, okay, enough with sending all this work home. We can't possibly have them do all this work, so we're going to opt out of all this work. Yeah. And then we have parents that are saying, more, they're going through it too fast. Can you help us? Or if you can't, can you help guide us to places where we can find more to supplement and to stretch? And again, I'm sure the teachers here can talk about those types of guidance that we do when we talk to parents about those kinds of things. Also is the idea that just because a kid isn't typing or isn't in front of a screen, that they're not using their time wisely. And I think that we really need to make sure that, because of what we're also finding out about, the cyberbullying, a lot of the stuff that's happening online, we have to be careful. We have to be monitoring, and we have to make sure that we got that balance. I should just say something I didn't say during the presentation, and many of you, I'd love to hear, are worried about this too. We're seeing such a surge in violence against children right now. Particularly girls, but we're getting reports left, right, and center about both child labor, child abuse, sexual abuse. So we're also trying to, it's not just about learning and supporting our members, we're also trying to support them in terms of being able to track their most vulnerable students, the most vulnerable kids.
Okay. And following, there has been a lot of reaction towards this this piece of news you gave about the teachers not being paid for 4 months in one of the countries in Africa. Is it something that you are seeing in other countries, or is just that example?
I mean, we haven't seen it yet, right?
Okay.
But I think there's some pretty expensive stimulus bills that have been going through, and countries are trying to figure out where to pay. And if the 80% of the recurrent education expenditure is going into salaries, and you're trying to do it within the education budget, I'm sure people are tempted there. You also don't have that counterweight of pressure to not even dare to do that because everyone's is sheltering in place. So we haven't seen it too many other places outside of there. What we do have is an agreement with the Global Partnership for Education, right? Because they really want to make sure that the continuation, so teachers are there to come back into school as soon as schools reopen. What they don't want is a number of furloughed teachers that are, off having other jobs, and then you're not able to get school to start. So the Global Partnership is going to put in a bunch of resources as well, try to backstop some of these. So if we can figure out which countries are having those types of fiscal problems prior, and that's to the ministers that are listening and others, then you also have a mechanism in the Global Partnership for Education, the 250 million that they just made available to sort of backstop ministries in GP countries.
Which country was it, Dave?
Sierra Leone.
Okay, Sierra Leone. Okay.
Okay. Dave, I have a question from Sean here. Has there been a sense from educators around looking ahead and seeing this focus on remote learning as an opportunity to lead into positive change in teaching methodology when we go back to the face-to-face?
Yeah, I think, you had these you've got the super teachers, right? So you've got the ones that are using tech anyway. We know them at GSF, and we know them, many of them are here, and it's just, they turn their schools into Hogwarts. They do all sorts of fantastic things, right? But then you had the then you have some of the sort of resistor. You have some of the more resistant, the sort of teachers are like, yeah, I'm not so sure I want to try that. But then when they have the opportunity to hold to meet, to do a video conference, or to tape themselves, or to think, how do I structure this? I know how I would lecture this, but how would I structure this if I could do it differently? If I could have all sorts of different artifacts and different experts brought in and different types of media, we are seeing somewhat of a more level of comfort in that first category of countries, the ones that already have. They're not worried as much about whether or not they have a job. They're actually thinking about, okay, had we had this platform in place, we could have done X, Y, and Z. For High Tech High in California, they just took their laptops home, and it was just, they just kept going, right? And so I think a lot of the people, I don't know if you follow Keith Kruger and Koen and those guys, but who've been kind of trying to help globally teachers and educators start thinking about how do you use that. I think now, when we have more options for professional development in IT and design workshops and learn by design, retreats and things, I think more people will be much more interested in partaking, because, right now in a lot of places, they're just trying to cover. They're just trying to get through stuff. They're trying to do their best in a very difficult time, because, they also have to go grocery shopping in the hour they can go grocery shopping, right?
Right. Sorry, I just kicked the person that was bombing out. The meeting has a password, but we share the link and probably somebody got it. So, but I already kicked the person out of the room, so we're fine already. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know. Go ahead, because.
Sorry, Dave. We have a great list of speakers. I hope you'll be able to stay for some of them. I know that you have to move on, but I want to actually call upon, and I'm going to start off with Australia first. So I'm going to call Yasodai Selvakumaran to the call. Yasodai is a phenomenal teacher leader from Australia who has a really interesting perspective on what's happening over there. Yaso, if you just speak to us in terms of what you are seeing, and anyone who has questions for Yaso, please put them in the chat box over there that we can share and ask questions about later. Thank you. Yaso, over to you. And thank you so much, Dave.
Thanks so much, Vikas, for the introduction. And I just want to say hi to everybody and thinking of everyone experiencing this in different parts of the world. In Australia, we thankfully have not been, I guess, as rapid in how COVID-19 has expanded here. But in terms of our response from schools, we've just started our Easter break here in New South Wales, and the last 3 weeks has been very full on for educators in every system and sector, as we sort of wait for daily updates and briefings in terms of what we do next. And what I would like to just highlight, I guess, as one of the biggest concerns at the moment is around assessment and what that final year assessment might look like for our Year 12 students. And there's been talk of, no Year 13. In my state, they have said that the high school certificate will go on. There are adjustments being made to that almost weekly. So, for example, music performances, the ensemble performances have been cancelled, and drama ensembles have been cancelled. There's major works that are generally marked by the board that are being still discussed over this holiday period. And our Year 12 students are halfway through their course, still knowing that they're going to get some sort of qualification, but it's that uncertainty for students, parents, and educators working towards that. And I guess as a high school teacher myself, and I have Year 12, this is something that I'm directly involved with. And I think with using technology and online learning, one of the things working in a school that's in a lower socioeconomic area is that we had to plan from the very start a continuity of learning plan, and this was encouraged by our system, to really think about what that would look like across grades, across programs. So for example, I co-lead teacher induction at our school. So we've come up with what this will look like both for students and staff to continue the learning. And for Year 7, 8 and 9 now, we have planned learning activities with a strong focus on quality lessons. Sorry, I'll just unmute. Sorry, I got muted there for a moment. We're really looking at how can we make sure that this learning is going on with a focus on ongoing assessment with every learning cycle. So to take away some of the pressure from this every lesson in the junior school, we've learned quickly that we can't have the same cognitive load that we would have in our classroom environment. So the last few weeks for us looked like most students, 95% of students in New South Wales public schools were learning from home. And so that change happened quite drastically, but we still had some students coming in, and schools are still open for the children of essential workers. But we are going into next term, still planning for that, but we haven't had an official announcement yet of what that will look like. Some of the issues, I guess, just with digital divide, and I know other people talk about this as well, is equity devices had to be provided for online learning for students. So we focused on Year 10, 11 and 12 getting a device, planned Year 7, 8 and 9 with booklets that were sent home with the same material that could be done, and taking on advice from school psychologists and counsellors to really make sure that there was a routine and it was simple for students and parents to follow. So having the same sort of routine with, say, a learning intention, success criteria, lesson outline, and being very understanding about when students are able to submit that work rather than having to be on in real time. So we've discovered very quickly that with parents working from home, multiple siblings in the house, there's, might be a lack of devices, the internet connections may not be good enough, and really responding to what that looks like. So going into next term, we're very much looking at having subject teams for each year group rather than a focus on classes. We're planning for what will happen if our teachers get sick or they've got to, look after members of their family. And how can we ensure that when we're using tools like Google Classroom, that we've got multiple teachers on that classroom? And we're looking at having remote learning coaches. So there might be a teacher or two in charge of a particular year group, and having backup and support. So no class is going to be left alone, and really trying to plan for every contingencies. And I just want to highlight that one of the strengths in our system, in the New South Wales public system, has been non-school based teachers in the system have been involved in setting up on time and point in need professional learning. So I myself signed up to a webinar last year on how to lead remotely. There were sessions on how to use Google Classroom, Adobe, the Adobe Suite, Microsoft Teams that teachers could access through our portal logins. And there's resources being added to that daily. There's also a resource website for parents. And so that professional learning in terms of the ICT support, but also subject-specific communities, professional learning communities have been created. Our department has set up a primary school Microsoft Teams staff room for the state. Every major subject and faculty have got a Microsoft Teams staff room. And so resources can be shared without fear of copyright infringements and things. And I guess that intellectual property component is another one with teachers planning at this time. And so that's been some real strengths in our system that I've been quite thankful for. And so, yeah, just going forward now, I guess it's really been about looking at what we can learn from other countries and systems around the world. And I think that's where we've had a bit of an advantage in being able to look at that. But our biggest lesson has been that, at home learning, we can't rely just on the internet. We need to be able to take and create resources, encourage teachers to focus on lesson design appropriate to their context. For example, a lot of the textbooks for particular year groups, especially in the lower years, are pitched way too high for some of the students at my school. And so it really has been about bringing subject teams together to develop resources that our students will be able to follow in a routine that they will be used to, but then considering that cognitive load and learning from others as well. I think my time's up. I can keep going, but I think my time's up.
Thank you. Yeah, so if there was one thing that you would tell a system leader in terms of allows you to do your job more effectively, what would it be?
It would be to really look at and trust teachers' judgment in designing, leading formative assessment at this time. And to be able to recognise that despite the fact this is a great opportunity for change and we're doing things differently, that it is still responding to a crisis. And so well-being needs to be at the heart of that. And that includes teachers, school leaders, and students to be able to do their job and to support parents in this as well. So I think that really focusing on formative assessment and looking at what we can use from that in designing the solutions going forward is really something that we need to consider.
There's a lot of agreement with what you're saying, lots of thumbs up and high fives going on around here. But the question that I wanted to ask was, is your comment is, if you limit it just to the current crisis period that we're in, what would be the one thing during this current crisis period? Because what you said, I think, is more longer term. But what would you want today to do your job better today?
Today, and I think it's definitely equity, in terms of funding and resources. I think that's what this crisis has revealed, is the disparities between the haves and the have-nots, not even just around the world, but even within the same system, the same geographical areas. And, thankfully our system has responded to issues of equity, but I know that not all systems have been so fortunate, and we still have work to do.
So yeah, so is it, I know that Dave will smile in a second, but yeah, so is it fair to put that entire burden on the teacher?
No, absolutely not. I think this is where I know a few weeks ago, a lot of teachers just didn't, they just wanted to thank you, in terms of all of the work that they were doing, whether that be from, their families, societies. I think we're sort of like this glue that's been going on behind the scenes to hold so many parts of the community together. and teachers have been working frantically to make sure that that happens. And so I think that's just something that, yeah, we just need to acknowledge more of and highlights why teachers really matter.
Thank you so much, Yaso, for contributing towards our conversation and our understanding today. I now want to bring on Jim Tuscano from the Philippines. Jim is a leader in the EdTech sphere and runs the EdTech department of a school. And he's also recently started his own blog and podcast site. Jim, can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in Manila and Philippines in general? I know that your minister is here also, so just be wary what you say. And over to you, my friend.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to apologize in advance. We've been talking about online learning. Technology has been very, very helpful, but just to give you a context, we've been having some problems in the Philippines in terms of internet connection. I live in Manila right now. I'm based in Manila, but we still encounter intermittent internet connection. I think because of the overload that is happening. I think everyone's at home and everyone's enjoying Netflix or something. Just to give a context to everyone, the basic education in the Philippines, that's K to 12, follows the June to March calendar, which is very different from the higher ed, which follows the global calendar of, or mostly the August-September calendar. When COVID-19 affected the whole country or the main island, we were on the last part of the school year, like March. We had to make sure that we decide on what to do with the last assessments, the last lessons, and eventually some schools and even DepEd, the Department of Education, I believe, reminded everyone that if it's not helpful anymore, and then we just drop the last assessment because it's been really challenging. Overhand, I think the effect has been minimized. The effect has been minimized basically because of the calendar, school year calendar, as compared to other countries which were affected right in the middle of the school year. In the Philippines, we were at the end of the school year. And basically my reflection is revolving around the idea of what do we learn from this experience so that when we start our new school year, which is pending usually in June, this coming June, we're going to start our new school year. And I say pending because the government and the Department of Education are deliberating on whether to push with the June opening. But some private schools, independent schools, have been also planning to move the school year to July or August, around that area. But because the Department of Education was able to make some planning ahead, I think we were able to minimize the effect of students staying in school. I just want to give an example, like for example, the Department of Education Commons program or project where they invested on creating online learning materials that are accessible to everyone. So it's an open resource accessible to everyone. And it has been gaining a lot of tractions, a lot of users. And I really credit the EdTech team of the Department of Education. And that has been really helpful also to contain, to give a sense of normalcy to our students or to our young kids who are staying at home. I am currently working on in the grade school unit of my school, and just a few reflections that I want to share. Some of the things that we're looking towards right now is we have four major ideas to look into, or realities. Number one, like what Yasodai has mentioned, I think the importance of ensuring equitable access to our students. The main default of a lot of school systems right now is going through online distance learning or online learning. But the situation has shown us the haves and the have-nots of a lot of our families. Even if they have access to an internet connected device, they have to share them with their fellow with their siblings, for example, and that has been really a problem among our families. My context as a student in the primary or elementary grades have shown me that it's really important to guide the younger students. I've seen in the chat questions that a note that says the younger students have been marginalized in this pandemic, and I would really agree with that. Not really marginalized, but teachers have been having a hard time thinking of how to continue learning for the younger students, especially when they are not really digitally equipped or equipped with digital skills needed for them to study online. Teachers have been caught also in rapid transition. So it's been really challenging for a lot of teachers teaching in the grade school to redesign their classroom experiences. And I would agree with Yasodai with what she said about the design of the lessons. It's been really hard to reimagine or redesign the lessons of younger students that really focus on using manipulatives, face-to-face encounter. And we know that early education really focuses or banks on face-to-face encounter. You know, the presence of a teacher builds trust in the student. So things like that. And of course, always a question of assessment.
Thank you, Jim.
It's been really hard. Yeah.
No, sorry, carry on. I thought you'd stopped.
The question of assessment also is very important, especially for younger students. We've been also thinking, personally, I've been also thinking, is it really ethical to grade younger students at this moment? I mean, that has been a big question. I'm not sure if that has been asked by the different teachers here or school leaders here, but maybe this is the opportunity for us to rethink the importance of grades again. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of grades in the education system, but with this kind of situation, how are we going to redefine or reimagine or gain a new perspective on the importance of grades? So I don't have much to share right now, just a lot of reflection, but three things that I want to maybe push as some reflection or something that we could think about, especially for our policymakers who are here. Number one, I think it's important that for younger students where I am currently anchored on, maybe it's more important to look at the safety or the social emotional dimension of teaching younger students right now. If adults can feel anxiety with in this time of pandemic, I think the kids are also badly hit by these kinds of anxiety, especially when they are uprooted from the normalcy, the routines that have been established in school. So let's think about the social emotional dimension of what it means to educate students for now. I think that is more important for me. Second, trust the teacher. Trusting the teacher also means providing the teacher opportunity to get ready with this kind of transitions or protocols that are happening. I think trusting the teacher means giving a proper funding for training, allowing the teacher to have access to resources also, to become better teachers at this time of pandemic. One more thing, which is very important, I hope that this situation fosters a more dynamic homeschool partnership. We always say that parents or the home is our partner, but we see how parents have been complaining about about the difficulty of doing homeschooling with their kids right now, and they appreciate the work of the teachers because of this. But also I want to push further. Maybe there can be a more solid homeschool partnership, especially for younger students. In the end, teachers will not be there. I think we always need to remind ourselves that when remote learning or distance learning happens, teacher is not there. And the teaching presence that they have is through the adult supervision that they have at home. So one way or another, we need to make sure that we are fostering or developing a solid homeschool partnership to ensure that the kids feel that they are still being supported, not just by the teachers anymore, but even by their parents. So that's it for now.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think one of the
thoughts?
Yeah, one of the things that you said, which I think is a pretty critical conversation, and I see it coming through in the comments over here. What I'd love for us to do, because I don't think we will solve for this here, but to share, if you could go to the LinkedIn group and actually answer this question, which Jim is posing, which is, how do you do online with primary learners? How do you do online with primary learners? If you could answer that question on LinkedIn and run a thread on that, I think that'll be very useful and beneficial to everyone. Jim, thank you so much for your comments. I'm very grateful. I'm going to now move on to Akshay Saxena from India. Akshay is the founder of the Avanti Fellows program, which looks at maths and science education for vast parts of India which are underprivileged. But Akshay, was a teacher at one time, is now a private sector entrepreneur, and he has this interesting perspective in India. Akshay, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Vikas, you can hear me, I hope.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I thought what I'll talk a little bit about is, and I think amazingly insightful comments, and it's actually quite heartening to see that much of the problems and the challenges that we're seeing are same around the world. Maybe I'll start off on a hopeful note. I'm going to flip my camera around. And if you can see some part of my screen, that is 100 odd kids from the slums of Mumbai learning on a Zoom meeting from a teacher who's using the floor of their home as a chalkboard. So just thought I'll start on something a little bit hopeful. So just to give, for those of you who aren't very familiar, India is an enormous country. And just to put numbers in perspective, there's about 150 million kids in our school system, which are government school kids and are underserved, right? So really, really low income kids. The other thing that's happened is, over time, given that the private sector has now, I think we have amongst the most diverse private sectors in education, where we are able to, we have private schools that teach from price points that are as low as $100 a year, all the way up to high-end private schools. So what's actually happened in the public school system is that only the most underserved are in those schools, and only the most vulnerable kids are in the government schools. What's happened in India is, I think, a combination of no planning whatsoever, right? And a very sudden move to shut the school system. So I will give you an example of, we manage about kids in about 50,000, 60,000 kids in high school classrooms, science and math classrooms in government schools each year. And we had 0 days notice and 0 minutes to plan for the transition. So the most that we were able to do was actually, the moment Mr. Modi announced at 8 p.m., go to Amazon and start ordering, Wacom tablets and, other things which we could possibly use to teach kids. A funny story I was telling Vikas was that of all the tablets I ordered, the only ones that arrived were the ones at my house. So for a few weeks, I was teaching in 3 languages, different kids. And I think this lack of preparedness, and I think there's some friends of mine from the sector, center, etc., on this call, as a consequence of which, I would say the last about 2 or 3 weeks, it's just been a mad, crazy scramble. both from the government end as well as from the civic society. And I think what's been quite astounding and amazing is how quickly people have come together. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, before I talk about all the problems, a few things that have happened through, through rapid and good old Indian jugaad, as we call it, or rapid innovation. Within the past 3 weeks, there's been a coalescing of almost all the open Hindi content that there is. Hindi is sort of the most commonly spoken language in the government, in the government schools in India. So we've been able to collate, for instance, these content, which is grade 9 through 12, as well as the content of several other good organizations like the Central Square Foundation, etc. And we've managed to actually pull together open learning resources, both in terms of video resources, worksheets, workbooks, PDF resources for almost everything from grade kindergarten to, not kindergarten, I would say grade 1 to 12. An important point that was mentioned by many others was, how do you even get this to the kids? At which I think what we are finding right now is, in high school, we're able to get it to about 40% of the students, because the kids and the parents are so aware of the importance of this time to learn that they're finding ways to get their hands on smartphones or intermittent internet connections. I think what's helping in India is the fact that data is really cheap and mobile phone connectivity is actually pretty widespread. So we're seeing only about a 40-50% drop-off rate when we try and get kids to start learning online in some way, which of course is synchronous and asynchronous. So downloading PDFs, I think a large percentage of the kids are being able to do. Doing take-home tests where they're taking pictures and sending them back to us, I would say about 30% of the kids are being able to do. We started doing live streaming classes on YouTube and TikTok recently. We're seeing about 25-30% attendance. So the numbers are not, substantive in terms of covering all the kids, but I think much higher than we thought they would be. And every day, I think we're finding ways in which to collaborate. And I think the government, because they didn't prepare at all, is, I think, for the first time in my last decade of working with them, actually open to listening to smaller organizations, more innovative organizations, and actually moving, which I think is very is heartening. So I do think that all of that is great. I think the problems, obviously, and are very extreme and very worrying. The first is that, I think, again, to put numbers in context, we lose about half of our kids who enter grade 1 by the time they get to grade 11, right? So more than half of our students actually drop out of the schools. And if you look at that dropout data a little bit more carefully, a majority of that is girls. What has happened, I think, even in the last 3 or 4 weeks is and I think, right, it's well over half, right? So the thing that's happened over the past few weeks is that, that the vulnerability of especially girl students who are entering high school and the likelihood of them dropping out has gone up dramatically, right? And we have several students who are right now, stuck at home, don't have food, are trying to learn on WhatsApp, but are also requesting us to find ways to get them, food and shelter and water. So, the plight of vulnerable children, I think, is something which will come more and more to the fore as this crisis deepens. And while on one end, I think we are seeing tremendous grit from parents, students, teachers, as well as the government in some ways to try and solve this in the way that they can, I just think a lot of what has happened in India is a massive tragedy. And the lack of planning and preparedness is appalling. And I think a few submissions to this, I think, which would have helped, and I heard them mentioned earlier, which is India has had an online teacher training portal called Diksha now for over 5 years. Several organizations have tried to contribute to it. It is a terrible platform, like it barely works online. And despite a lot of push and effort from many people, I think several people on this call, the lack of effort on trying to make that work in the years prior is now going to show. Whereas now, I think overnight somehow, every state government seems to have launched an online learning program with no content or badly organized content and a teacher training program. So I think India's lack of preparedness for this is going to start showing very, very fast. And I completely agree with the speakers before me that I think if more effort had been done on continuous teacher training, that could have been the single biggest thing that actually helped. And also the other was training teachers to organize, and training teachers to organize online is again something that we are finding even within our own organization. We were somewhat underprepared. And within the government school teachers also, that turned out to be a massive gap, right? Which is, it takes a certain degree of skill and effort to organize communities, especially underserved communities online, which I think we were terribly underprepared for. And and the last thing I really wanted to say, because I'm conscious of everyone's time, is that for those who are policymakers here, and especially those who are in a position to drive policy in India, I think it's really, really important that not now perhaps, but following on from this crisis, I think it's really important we unite our voices and make a very, very loud appeal to government, especially in developing countries and underserved regions, that this is the new normal. And if we do not do things to prepare for this better, this tragedy, which I can assure you will be a terrible, terrible tragedy in India in terms of kids falling out of school and and other problems, will just keep repeating itself and compounding itself. Yeah, that's all I had.
If there was one intervention, Akshay, for India, which is just humongous, like you said, the numbers were just like staggering. If there was one intervention, if you were the human resources minister in India, what would that one thing be in this current crisis that you'd do?
Teacher training and preparedness.
But that is a long tail. But what about to overcome the current challenge that you have?
Immediately, I think immediately make data plans free. If anyone's in a government school, it's only 100 rupees right now, and we are paying for that, and I'm sure many other non-profits are paying for it. It's 100 rupees, and Jio's making enough money, right? So if we could just make data free during the crisis, for at least for kids who are in government schools and can prove it, it'll help enormously, because I think Android phone penetration is actually pretty good.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sorry, because one
Sure.
point I wanted to ask actually, and that has been brought up by David, but also by Christian Williams on the chat, is this emotional connection, the need for the emotional connection. And I would like other speakers to talk about it a little bit. How can we use technology? One of the kids, the one in 3rd grade, is having physical education through the Zoom class. So they are not using technology only to push knowledge, but also to try to socialize and do other type of connection. And so they did like a gym class on Zoom with the kids the other day, and he had a lot of fun. So I would like to see if there are other examples of trying to change the usage of technology, and not just to push knowledge, but to use it for other means of social connection and emotional connection.
Yeah. So, fantastic question. I can only share what's working well for us. So let me focus on that. So I think one is sort of sharing personal lives. I think, there's a lot of empathy, and I think I work with slightly older kids, right? So, showing them my home, cooking in front of them, like, playing with, doing play. Play is, I think, really, really important. A lot of kids are under a lot of stress. So I think and this would be what's worked really well for us, is I open the first 15 minutes of every class with play, right? Something funny, something about my own life, talking about things that I'm struggling with. I gave myself a haircut, it's terrible. These things really, really help. Especially for teachers who are talking to kids through the internet, either through video or content. The other is, I think, making the effort to reach out to individual students, even if you can do it once in 15 days, is incredibly important. I think the speaker before me mentioned, it's really important to have a 30:1 if possible, but if not, as close as you can get, ratio of sort of teaching facilitators to students. And their job changes, right? Their job is not assigning homework. Their job is just making sure these kids are well, that you're talking to them, you're talking to their parents, you're understanding what they're doing to create a safe space for learning. So I think, being funny, sharing your own life, and doing, parental counseling has worked well for us. It's actually one of my biggest questions. So I'd love to sort of follow the group afterwards and see what else we can do while being virtual.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to move from India to China. Jiang is a teacher, is a authoritative commentator, and probably the best person that I've met who gives it how it is in China. And given the system and the fascination about China because of PISA and that kind of thing, Jiang has absolutely informed me over the years about what happens there. Jiang, can you give us your perspective on what's happening in China, and when it comes to policy, how do you see the great asks that you're making from your Ministry of Education?
Right. Thanks, Vikas. So from many perspectives, China moving to education technology has been a success story. And there are three major reasons why China has been so successful so far. One is that there's cohesion in society. Parents, teachers, society are all focused on educating a child, so that when kids are going studying online, parents are very supportive, right? So that's reason one. Reason two is that the Chinese school system is focused mostly on information delivery, and that's pretty easy to translate online. The third reason is that Chinese education for the past 10 years has been very focused on building up its education technology capacity. This is what's called Future School Project. And the vision is, if you can imagine a high-speed railway system, which China is very proud of, and which has been very successful, imagine that for Chinese education, right? So content being able to funnel seamlessly from very good schools to the most needy schools. Now, what's interesting is that because of China's success, because of China's success in education technology, we're seeing tremendous fundamental issues in Chinese education. And I'll just highlight two for the purpose of the time, okay? The first issue is intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Now, the problem with the Chinese school system, which I've been commenting a lot on, is that Chinese schools are built entirely around extrinsic motivation. You put 50 kids in a classroom and you have them compete against each other for a test score. And your test score determines praise from your teachers. It determines rewards from your parents. And it determines your sense of self-worth. So let me give you an example to illustrate the power of extrinsic motivation in Chinese schooling. So the biggest news coming out of Chinese education during coronavirus is that they've announced that the Gaokao, the National College Entrance Examination, will be postponed by a month. Now, that hasn't happened in Chinese education for the past 30 years. The Gaokao is the biggest thing in Chinese education, and moving it is a tremendous signal no confidence in your coronavirus response. So I was very surprised by the government's reaction. I was also surprised because I thought, test preparation, it's all about sitting at home, memorizing text, and doing test questions. Why do you need to go to school to do test preparation? My wife, who did go through the Chinese school system, she explains there are two good reasons. The first reason is that what matters in Chinese education is not how well you do on tests. What matters is how you do relative to your peers. So being in a classroom and knowing how your peers are doing allows you to self-assess and developing learning strategies to overcome them. And the other big thing is just purely motivational, right? So the best thing about Chinese education, the thing that everyone has to witness for herself are these pep rallies for tests. So during those 2 days in June and July when they take the test, they do a lot of pep rallies before. And you can imagine these football pep rallies in the United States, people get really wild up. But to imagine the ferocity and intensity of these pep rallies, imagine this. Aliens have invaded China, and they're about to kill everyone. And the only way to save the nation, the only way to save your family is by doing well in the Gaokao. And these pep rallies, they'll chant out slogans like, 1 point means 1 more point means 3,000 defeated enemies, okay? So these pep rallies are crazy. So what they're discovering is that in a system that's built entirely on extrinsic motivation, if you move everything online, students don't have the motivation to learn, okay? Which leads to the second big issue, maintaining the student-teacher dynamic. Now in China, teachers are extremely well respected. They're like gods. And that gives them complete control over the classroom. But once they move online, then the dynamic changes because students are much more adept and clever than teachers at navigating the online world, right? So from my perspective, online just means teachers delivering information. But there are so many ways for students to disrupt learning online. And so I'll just give some examples. The first example is that teachers assign apps to do homework. And what students have figured out very quickly is that if they downvote the apps on the App Store, the algorithm removes the app from the store, which means that kids don't have to do homework anymore. What kids have also discovered is that they can figure out which software is pirated by the teachers, and then they report the pirated software to the companies. Companies launch a formal complaint against the teachers. The teachers can't teach anymore. And the third example is, so it's very funny, but in the Chinese language, so in the Chinese language, there are a lot of homonyms, okay, words that sound exactly the same. So the words for peptide bonds is the same for Unix, and the words for methyl molecule sounds exactly the same as phallus, okay? So a high school chemistry teacher, she was saying online, she was lecturing online to her kids. Let's look what happens when we attach a methyl molecule onto a peptide bond. Okay? Very simple chemistry information. And then what the kids heard was, hey kids, let's see what happens when we attach a phallus onto a Unix. So two things happened, right? First thing that happened is that the kids laughed. The second thing that happened is that the kids reported the teacher right away to authorities for using lewd language online. So there are so many ways for students to disrupt learning online, and they do it because the power dynamic, teachers have complete control over everything, which makes kids resentful. And so they resort to these tactics. So that's the situation in China right now.
Thank you so much, Jiang. Are there any questions for him? I know that we have some unwelcome guests on this Zoom call, which Esteban is dealing with. But Jiang, in terms of the technology play in particular, we're seeing, even before the crisis, we were seeing a huge adoption in terms of edtech products in the system. What has happened to these tools over this period? I'd love to know that. Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So, China has been a very early adopter in education technology. In fact, the vision the vision is to be the global leader in education technology. But the issue is that for the past 10 years, the approach to education technology has been very ad hoc, meaning that localities have to be responsible for developing their own edtech platforms. And so these platforms don't synchronize well. You have competing edtech platforms. Now, what's interesting about coronavirus is that the Ministry of Education sees this as a perfect opportunity to come in and say, listen, we need to consolidate and centralize edtech platform. Why? Because one, it's to address the equity issue, right? Rich places like Shanghai, and access to that technology, whereas the provinces are being left behind, right? So we need to fix the equity issue. Second issue is quality, right? So when you have we have a consolidated national edtech platform, you can start using artificial intelligence and big data to mine the data to figure out specific learning trajectories for each individual child. So the vision of it is then have this platform and then empower with AI to make sure that all children are learning. So that's a vision. But first, what they have to do is consolidate all these different competing edtech platforms. And now the hope is that with coronavirus in place, the Ministry of Education finally has authority to do that. Thank you so much, Jiang. I really appreciate all the comments. I now want to move to Marj Brown in South Africa. Marjorie is a phenomenal teacher, fought for the independence of South Africa, for the apartheid struggle. And I'd love to hear from you in terms of what your experience is. Can I please request everyone to be on mute? And I realize that there are people, unwanted guests over here, and I know Esteban is dealing with it. And we should be a little bit careful as to what happens here. But Marjorie, over to you.
Thank you, Vikas. I just want to thank Vikas and Esteban for this opportunity. I think it's wonderful that we are sharing in such depth. We face a very big problem of inequity in South Africa. And as a result of that, we've seen a coalition of over 190 NGOs trying to monitor what's happening in our country during this virus. And alongside that, we have a government that has really tried to pull together, communicate with people, and try and do its level best during this problem. I teach in a country where our term starts in January and ends at the beginning of December. So this virus hit us quite soon in the school year, and we now are in the 19th day of our lockdown, where schools have been closed and nobody is allowed out of their homes except to go and get medicine and food. In our school, which is an independent school, we were able to send our children home with devices. Kids that were on bursaries got an iPad and some data. But the majority of children in South Africa do not have access to data or to electronic devices. So it is very difficult to look at our country with one lens. The government, the Department of Education, of Basic Education, has done a lot using radio, television, Siavula, which is an online education resource provider. Publishers have come on board with free access to information. But as long as you've got data or a device, that's fine. But it's the lack of data and the lack of devices that are really going to leave so many children behind. In 2015, the Supreme Court ordered that every child should have a textbook of their own for every subject. And that still has not happened. So there are many schools where children are sharing textbooks. That's not all schools, but where textbooks were shared, obviously children are not all allowed to be sent home with the textbook, even though the Department of Education sent them home with a workbook and with a sort of timetable, a schedule of what should happen. So on the issue of textbooks, it becomes imperative that the department should ensure with these goodwill publishers or photocopying that children have access to printed information, particularly those that don't have access to data. But at the same time, we have a terrible level of illiteracy in our country. The PIL survey in 2016 showed that 78% of learners from grade 4 do not understand what they're reading. So verbal education becomes very important on radio and television and not just the printed word. And there's a lot of attempts by the department. They are using WhatsApp groups for the 25,000 primary school teachers who've been part of a government initiative of a primary school reading program, texting teachers with attached resources on WhatsApp. So the equity in resources is sadly lacking. The department has also got a curriculum recovery plan, which will involve when children do go back to school at the end of April, that they will have fewer school holidays, they will have extended hours of school, and that the curriculum will be shaved into the more core components of each year group, and that assessments will go ahead, but assessments will also be restructured according to what work is covered. In terms of all this, it sounds fantastic, and in one part of the curriculum recovery plan, there is a need to offer psychosocial support. But for me, that's really where we keep talking about how teachers need to also be trained in offering psychosocial support to students. But we know that teachers themselves are also fairly traumatized by this situation in some countries where death rates are rising. Last night, we heard that our virus will probably peak in September and that the death rates will grow exponentially between now and then. And I'm very reminded of Armando in Italy, where he was saying, to begin with, they had online lessons in a particular school. Then the lessons tapered off because they realized that full-on lessons with online, with following the full content of curriculum was too stressful, so they toned down. But then lastly, they had to offer a lot more psychosocial support because of the increasing death rate in their community. So I think we have to look at the phases of this virus and look at how we can support this. In South Africa, the Department of Education does have a handbook for dealing with trauma, but it's a handbook and it is not, teachers are not professionals in this scenario. We can be taught to identify trauma and respond to it. But I think we're talking about a lot of depth in the need for psychosocial support. We've seen an incredible increase of abuse of children during this period. And the educational psychologists in South Africa are few and far between. And if we look at educational psychology, counseling psychology, clinical psychology, universities here turn out about 12 students in a master program a year to keep the profession highly professional. But in times like this, we notice that the dearth of this need. Often in our education districts, there will be one educational psychologist for the whole district. So I would also call on the government to increase this psychosocial support by increasing and lending far more support to educational psychologists. If a pupil sees an educational psychologist outside of school, they are not able to claim that on medical aid. They live in a zone where they rely very heavily on schools employing them, and only really independent schools can employ them. So I think we need to work in a much more holistic fashion in terms of the support that we give children, as well as the teaching support. And I was just mindful that one of the things that Peter Ferris did, that he was acknowledged for in the Teacher Prize, was the Ring of Peace. And Peter, I would really think that it would be wonderful to start a Ring of Hope on WhatsApp at this time throughout the world, for teachers to share with their children, for children to contribute messages of hope. And let's start a Ring of Hope for children. We also have this extraordinary situation in South Africa of criminality, where in my province alone, 55 schools have been, during this 19-day lockdown period, have been looted. The school nutrition food has been taken, the desks, the printers, the computers. So that's 55 schools less when children go back to school at the end of this month. And I would call on our government to really deploy army to the schools to protect them, because we're talking about millions of rand to recover these schools. And we also have a huge problem in that we have government creating wonderful suggestions of responding to the poor and needy in our country, who we have over 10 million children receiving school meals, which they're not receiving at the moment. And government has said that it will deliver food parcels. Well, the early childhood education projects that we support have not received a parcel in these 19 days. So we have slow delivery of relatively good policy, and that needs to be stepped up big time. Those are just some of the issues I'd raise.
Thank you, Marjorie. A really insightful presentation on what happens in South Africa. I am actually very conscious of time, so I want to move on if that's okay. I want to go next to Koen Timmers. Koen is in Belgium, and what he has done with regards to refugee education and actually using blended models, I think is phenomenal. Koen, can you please tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this subject?
Hi, this is Koen. So I've been teaching for 20 years in Belgium, and to give you a context, we have
can you please, thank you.
Yeah,
Koen?
so we have a population of 11 million, which is important to know, quite the same as Sweden, Portugal, and Greece. And in Belgium, most people do have an internet connection and computer. And what's interesting to see is that We are now in lockdown for 5 weeks, and during the first 2 weeks, the government organized that an NGO called Close the Gap assembled like 20,000 laptops, and those were given to the students who don't have access to technology. And the main internet provider in Belgium, they made internet access for free. So we are basically in a good spot here. So my stance in this debate is more like how to use technology in case you have access to it, which may not be a fair point, but still. So what's interesting to see is that the government tried to make sure that everybody has technology, but there's still a blind spot here because a lot of teachers don't know how to use the technology. And what they start to do is they use the tool as a starting point and not the pedagogy and the content anymore. So I teach in 2 different schools, and they both had a very different approach. One of the schools is the teacher training department in which I teach. So they locked the school before even the government locked the schools, closed the schools. And what they did is that every teacher had to replace the classes at school by distance learning and synchronous distance learning, so using Zoom. Another school in which I have been teaching for 20 years, in that school, we have been doing distance learning for 15 years with only the web design department. And that school didn't even allow me to teach remotely during the lockdown. So they both took care of the situation very differently. Now, distance learning is not that buzzword anymore. You know, it's everybody's speaking about it, and it may replace the classroom, but not the teacher. And what's happening right now is that teachers, even they don't really know how to use the technology, but in case they do, they only focus on the tool itself, like Zoom. I'm going to teach using Zoom because everybody is doing it. And now I need to know how to do it. So I'm trying to fetch a manual, and I start to teach my students. But that's basically a very wrong way to deal with this. So a few thoughts on this. I think that we need to focus firstly on synchronous and asynchronous learning. Sometimes we need those live interactions. And sometimes the asynchronous, like the video classes you give to your students, they allow the students to learn on their own pace and learn on demand. And I think that different ages and subjects in schools require a different approach as well. There's no holy grail. We really need a nuance in this. Like, for instance, like when you teach in secondary education, you may teach using Zoom live literacy or something like that. But in primary education, it may not make sense to teach live. But what may make sense is that just the teacher has a very informal moment with the students because they need their teacher. They need to see those teachers and have an interaction with them. And learning how to write the letter K doesn't make any sense on a distance, you know. Also, there's a very huge debate about the type of education we prefer in our country. Like, there is a very knowledge-based approach in the UK and other countries, while there is more like a skills-based and project-based and problem-solving approach in India and Canada, etc. But when we speak about distance learning, we try to use technology, and all of a sudden it's all about knowledge. You know, it's not anymore about problem solving and skills based. That's not the issue anymore. Everybody is speaking about we have to deliver content, and that's an issue as well. And I noticed Christian Williams's remark in the chat, and he claimed that he tackled that stance about online learning and content delivery, and that it's important to make a distinction between online learning and content delivery. And he's really right about that part. But what I think is that what's really crucial, and there's been a lot of research about this part, is that we need to activate our students. We need to make sure that they understand what they are learning, that they are actually learning using quizzes, etc. but also sending out a survey like, how do you feel about this? Do you prefer this kind of learning, etc.? And I think that a school needs to decide on the tools they will use as well, not like bombing students with 10 or 100 different tools, because it's, yeah, a lot of teachers, they know a lot of tools and they try to use them all together, you know. It's just like you have to make that wise decision, like this subject is to be taught on a distance, synchronous or asynchronous. And when we are going to teach synchronous, we are going to use like Zoom. And in case we're going to teach asynchronous, we create small videos which we send to the students. It's quite easy as that. And so my point has been about teachers who have access to technology, but I've been doing work with refugees as well in the Kakuma refugee camp. And it was a real struggle over there. I heard some bad things about poor students today, but they really have nothing, not even a pen. So it was really a challenge to teach them with internet connection, with Skype. And so we noticed that there is technology which makes internet available offline, like the Rachel device, which is quite inexpensive. It's based on Raspberry Pi, and it makes like Wikipedia, TED, Khan Academy, a lot of books available offline. So you have to focus on those kind of technology as well. So, and then Marj's Ring of Hope. What we have been doing is like launching global projects as well, focusing on empathy, making sure that everybody is happy. We did with Alex the Plant Ad. We asked students to tackle climate change and plant trees globally. So I think that having technology and a little bit of internet connection allows us to make learning global as well. So all of a sudden we can have interactions between students from Malawi, Australia, Canada, and so many different countries. And it's not always about knowledge. It's also about sharing empathy and other skills, and just focusing on other stuff sometimes.
Koen, speak a little bit more about that project, please.
Yeah. So what we did is like in 2017, I launched the Climate Action Project, and right now, every year in October, we have like 100,000 students from 98 different countries, and they all focus on one single subject, which is climate. And climate change is very different in different countries. And what we don't want is that the teacher make sure that the students are learning the definition of climate change by heart, you know. That's not what we want to do. And then assess, no, what we want is a student-centered approach in which the students are able to share what they think and believe about climate change. And then magic happens, basically. They're all able to share what they think. Some create videos, some take pictures, drawings, and this led to real solutions, like students in America with Brian. They created a solar suitcase which brought free electricity to African schools, you know. And we had Andrews, they planted 60 million trees with presidential support in Malawi. So a lot of real cool stuff happened just by sharing thoughts and a lot of things on one simple website, basically. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Koen. You're very kind for sharing that. I'm going to move on now to, you know, a lot of the focus when it comes to what's happening during COVID has been around vulnerable children, and especially those with learning difficulties, special education needs. And on the call, the next presenter is probably one of the most prolific special needs educators in the UK. I'd like to welcome Vijita Patel to give her comments. She's the principal of a school in London. Vijita, over to you.
Hi, everybody, and a pleasure to just hear everybody's reflections. A lot of what I'm going to say does resonate with the previous colleagues as well. We're in London. London, as far as lockdown, essentially for many of us, we have transitioned to virtual schools, similar to what colleagues have shared across the group. When we think about special educational needs, I want to pull that out beyond what could be cognitive delay, mental health needs, complex medical, sensory, hearing, visual impairments, and think more broadly about additional needs because of the reality of what the pandemic will do for the education sector. And when we think about these cohorts of pupils, when we take a step back and think actually as far as crisis response, it's really remarkable to see the level of infrastructure that has gone into place, whether one's a rural school, urban, the reality that school leaders and teachers together have worked with their communities to develop a virtual school that's going to continue education. I do hold on to the remarkable sort of developments that have taken place there. I think what we need to do is recognize that there is currently quite a prevalence on the digital sort of infrastructure that's sitting around the construct of how this virtual school will feature. And what we want to do is make sure we're considering the priorities for pupils with additional needs as that is getting developed, maturing, and sort of best practice models are shaping what schools are doing currently. When we think about the special needs population and more broadly, any pupil with additional needs, teachers are very much balancing a lot of metacognition across the sort of holistic priorities for pupils. So we have got a number of children that and cohorts where working memory, task switching, everything that has to link to the neuroscience of learning with executive function, is equivalent in priority alongside sense of self, developing their self-confidence, balancing quite sort of sensitive and fragile mental health priorities in order to really develop the holistic needs of the child or young person alongside their engagement with content and subject-specific curriculum. Teachers are highly skilled at promoting that engagement. And I'm very mindful of the impact that virtual schools have on that process of pedagogical interaction between the teacher, the group of pupils, and how highly skilled teachers are at being able to facilitate learning and mobilize the holistic development for pupils. The knowledge of that holistic picture for their class is very much anchored on relationships. And it's so inspiring on a daily basis to hear the knowledge that teachers have of their children, their students, and some of the motivators that can be quite subtle to move from the delivery of a lesson to actually the engagement in the process of learning and facilitating the independence for the child. For pupils with additional needs, this is significant and quite fundamental to also developing that sense of self and their personal confidence in who they are and who they can be, because often this population can be marked by a number of deficits with age equivalency. Mobilizing teachers to be able to balance the academic scaffolds that are currently the focus point, whether that's digital or the way that physical learning is going to get out to communities and to families during lockdown, is as relevant as us considering the next priority, which is going to be around those emotional scaffolds. How are we mobilizing teachers to be able to balance the two? Because this is really challenging when the class is not directly in front of you, when that key relationship is going to be quite significant and pivotal to be able to support the trust and the confidence a child has during times of significant uncertainty. The reality is that the holistic priorities for the wider population beyond the group with additional needs is going to now become an equivalent priority. And it is going to be quite significant for us to take on as educators, because this is the challenge that we're facing. Pupils with additional needs and special educational needs would have had that at the heart of a lot of short and medium-term planning to promote their engagement. But we're going to recognize that the wider population of children and young people are essentially growing up within a pandemic atmosphere and climate. And so their emotional well-being is going to be crucially at the core of what a lot of the agility with curriculum design is. it has resonated with previous speakers and colleagues. Formative assessment sits at the heart of this, with pupils with special educational needs and pupils that have additional mental health priorities as well. The pivotal part of that is about that relationship, knowledge, and understanding of the child or the young person and being able to shape it. So for me, I want to ensure that what can be sometimes the very invisible population is actually a group that may be shaping what we're doing more broadly for cohorts across the entire school and the entire virtual school sort of consideration, whatever our context is. My school, for example, majority of pupils are marginalized in their local community because of their special educational needs. Significant number live below the poverty belt. We've had to take various measures to ensure that they can access the digital element of what a virtual school could be. But actually, when we asked our teachers what they felt was necessary to promote quite meaningful learning versus a day-to-day management of a crisis, it was about physical resources and the way that we were going to support families to have what was needed to have a more authentic learning experience versus one that was going to be managing the day-to-day. So I would share 3 priorities that I think we can really hold on to as we're trying to mobilize teachers and educators in this new normal. The first is around formative assessment, which we've spoken about, and it's sharing some of the lessons we've learned from the more complex end of the sector. What we find quite powerful is the opportunity that sits there to actually have families as part of the co-construction with formative assessment. So it's not about the teacher having to unpack and decipher what that learning experience was through potentially technology, or it might be through telephones, depending on the sort of infrastructure in your locality, but actually the potential role in us being able to co-construct this with family members so that we're providing an anchor in the home environment that almost allows the child to recognize the role of their teacher within their home. And for the family to be able to, as they're experts of their child, shape that picture on progress and development. What we've found certainly is very valuable for us is for anybody who does have the digital infrastructure available is a sort of platform called Evidence for Learning. If you just Google Evidence for Learning, we find it very user-friendly, very versatile, and one that is already in the system, shaped by teachers through a very innovative technology organization. The second part for me is the agility of the curriculum. So whilst we are trying to continue and complete schemes of work, programs of study, the reality that actually at the moment we need to consider that bolted on sort of additional component around the curriculum, which has to do with COVID itself. Our pupils' understanding of what this new normal is, their sense of how they fit into this, their sense of the vulnerability they're watching with their families and their communities is the most significant learning opportunity at the moment. And their sense of self and who they are within their peer group, but also their sort of family unit, whilst we're all siloed and separated, is a significant priority. And for pupils with special educational needs and additional needs, even more so, because understanding that without being able to generalize and maximize that through a sort of shared context and knowledge based whilst being in lockdown scenarios can be quite challenging. And the anxiety level and the stress that can rise for families through that is significant as well. I do think that what we should bear in mind is the power of mobilizing teachers to co-construct what that curriculum is, and that agility in the curriculum being shaped by pupils themselves, because they've got the questions they want answered. We actually probably have similar questions ourselves, and so it's quite a unique sort of scenario for us to consider what this could be. Alongside this, for me, quite fundamentally, is teacher well-being. So the most powerful pedagogy, the most dynamic and extraordinary pedagogical approaches come through such strong knowledge and understanding of a teacher's understanding of their pupils. And those relationships and the strength of those relationships is really the beauty of the profession and something that we see celebrated regularly. At this time, the pressure that teachers are carrying in trying to understand what challenges their pupils face, it's going to vary child to child. Pupils with additional needs, the metacognition wrapped around supporting them to be able to interact with processing what is happening, how does that make you feel, do you feel secure, your confidence levels, all the progress that may have taken place in the school year, suddenly feeling some of the setbacks to that are going to really motivate teachers to want to go that extra step. The gravity of what the profession has carried is, I think, immeasurable. And our recognition that our workforce is currently being resilient for themselves, for their own families, alongside the resilience for their pupils and their peers and colleagues, is something that we don't want to underestimate. And the potential for us to make sure that the sector leaders and those at the heart of government recognize how much this profession is the hub for many families, the amount that they will be supporting. And I think that is relevant whether it's a special needs population or not. For pupils with additional needs, it'll be even more significant. And if any of those teachers were unwell, they would still be carrying that pressure because they know the fundamental role they play for the balance of a family. So for me, some of the answers sit in conduits across networks like this network itself. Teachers are very much owning their profession. They're shaping what the profession is and should be. And technology is quite powerful for mobilizing that as well. Sharing best practice, sharing quick solutions, sharing ideas. We shouldn't underestimate that we don't need a lot of policymakers to problem solve that. Those solutions are already at the hands of very highly skilled professionals. And the autonomy that Yaso sort of mentioned at the start as the first speaker, and really giving that platform for that consideration is, I think, quite pivotal to supporting the well-being priority that sits there as well. As far as pupils with additional needs, there's a lot of solutions that sit in that sector that could now be quite valuable for the majority across the workforce.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Vijita. Lots of learning there. There's quite a few comments. Can I please just remind everyone that the vast majority of our speakers already are on that LinkedIn group, and you'll be able to get a hold of them there. And I'm sure there's some tweeting going on and some Facebooking going on that you can tag the speakers that you know on. Please do also feel free to reach out. But the LinkedIn group is set up for that reason, and lots of questions being asked that we should address. But once again, thank you, Vijita, for your contribution. I now want to come to Nadia Lopez in New York. We know that New York in particular is going through a very tough time at the moment. Nadia is a phenomenal leader, principal of a school, and I remember visiting it actually, where she has this placard that says, "I opened a school to shut a prison," or something to that effect. Nadia, I'd love to hear from you because firstly, I hope things are going better in New York, but secondly, I'd love to learn about your experience and what you're seeing in your system.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much, Vikas, for the introduction. As you stated, New York City, New York State has been hardest hit in the United States in terms of COVID. I've personally lost mentors, friends on a daily basis. It's not a day that doesn't go by that I don't start out with saying my condolences to someone. My entire staff and my scholars have been impacted. We've had a family where literally 3 family members passed away within 24 hours. So just understanding the magnitude of what's happening. But what makes this very interesting, and I appreciate what everyone has already shared about their experiences. But New York is very unique, and we tend to talk about how we've never faced this. This is the first time in history. And while it's true, it's the first time we're dealing with a health crisis to this magnitude in this century. New York is not absent of the amount of crisis that we've had to deal with. So whether it was 9/11, whether it was a blackout that followed that in 2002, whether it was Hurricane Sandy, we have been faced plenty of times where children have been out of school because of a major crisis and had to figure things out. So as I listen to Akshay from India, and he spoke about the lack of planning, that holds true for New York. We found out as educators that school was going to close on a Sunday, and that we couldn't return on Monday, and we only had 3 days to plan for remote learning. And while New York City primarily is one of the richest cities in the world, we also are faced with one of the highest concentration of poor neighborhoods. And the depth of what we are dealing with in terms of the disparities when it comes to that number of health cases, people who have died in New York, in Brooklyn alone, where my school is located, has been quite significant. And so you cannot separate healthcare from education. And there's been a lot of blame on the fact that people of color, African Americans, Latinos, we're responsible for that. But the reality is that for me, when we talk about equity, equity is a choice. And it's not a choice that is made by those who have been disadvantaged and underprivileged. It is a choice by those who create policies and allocate the funding for budgets, right? And so that goes beyond us. And what I have to deal with on a daily basis is ensuring that children get adequate and quality education without the adequate funding. So our school doesn't have enough technology for the entire population. We only have 210 children, but we have 210 children that is comprised of 32% that have been tested and evaluated and diagnosed with a type of learning disability, a mental health disorder, any of those things. But in reality, if you looked at my numbers, it would probably be closer to 65% of our children have some type of special need. In addition to that, we have varying teachers with different types of experiences. So you can have significantly newer teachers who are very tech savvy versus veteran teachers who struggle more, who, as Koen said, know how to use Zoom, but do they know how to actually interface and interact with children? And so the lack of planning across the board for our city did not allow for us to address those needs as a school district. And so priority had to be given to what are the needs? What do we need to make sure has to happen? Because all of our children are not able to access technology. In Brownsville alone, 1 in 5 children who attend our schools are homeless. They live in shelters. They do not have access to Wi-Fi. So while we might have given them some type of handheld device, they wouldn't even have access to the Wi-Fi system or a hotspot, which is our reality. So our team had to literally come together, create packets for the entire school. So it didn't matter if children had access or not. We created 210 packages that consisted of every single subject area, that also consisted of reading books, because one of the things that we don't take into consideration is that children don't have access to library books in their own homes. The libraries that we had in our community is surrounded by gangs. So our children often don't go to the libraries anyway, because we have more than 40 gangs in our community. So we had to package every one of these book bags that we gave to our children to ensure they had everything that they possibly could need in these backpacks. Because we have so many students with special needs, because we have children who are English language learners, my teachers in the 3 days, and even beyond that, we're now into week 4 of online learning, distance learning, had to record their instructions, giving step by step by step how children can solve problems, how children can look at books and analyze the text, how children can engage in science projects as well. This was very, very intentional because we know that our parents, many of them are illiterate. Many of our parents are managing 5 or 6 children in their households. We also understand that we may ask a family, do you have technology, without the understanding that technology may be limited to a cell phone. A cell phone is not the same as a laptop and how it interfaces with Google Classrooms. If you have 5 children and all children are in the public school system and they all have to be online, we had to understand that every child can't get online and do the work at the same time. So creating flexibility. But what the pandemic has really revealed is truly the disparities and how underprepared we are, not just as a city of New York, but just globally. Because what was very telling was the fact that when the Chancellor of New York and the mayor stated that 300,000 children in New York City do not have access to technology, it was amazing how they were able to get companies like Apple to donate iPads. They were able to get companies like T-Mobile to provide Wi-Fi services in these iPads. And my question was, why couldn't we look at the data before? Why couldn't we look at the data beyond state exams and disaggregating that and saying what grade level children are on, and not look at it as from a community point of view of saying, what do children need? What are they lacking in their community? What are they lacking in their schools? That's how we need to allocate funding, because it's unfair that we're providing funding across the board for every school with one number. In New York City alone, we only receive $4,500 per child. $4,500 per child. New York State allocates $12,000 per child. If the child is special needs, they allocate up to $24,000 per child. By the time we get the funding in the school, we only get a quarter of that money. So that's why I don't have a computer science teacher. That's why I have a point person. I have a teacher who loves tech, and I was able to get her trained, and she was the one who was able to onboard the entire school, children, parents, teachers, onto an online system. We don't have the professional development that we need because we have to prioritize our money based off of salaries. It sounds like a lot. $2.1 million is what our budget is, but when $1.8 million is for salaries alone, I don't have enough money for supplies, professional development, all the technology that we need for the building. So now as we're in the pandemic, the city and the state realizes, and the federal government, wow, there's so many people in the communities that are impoverished that are being impacted by health. We need to make sure we have more ventilators in the hospitals. We need to make sure we have mental health support. So now you have people who are, I appreciate people volunteering their time to provide mental health support, but why couldn't we have had mental health support from before? And overall, this has been tremendously stressful. And so like any good principal, any good leader, you develop relationships with your team and you understand the pulse of what's going on. So what we've had to do to be creative, a couple of things. So I already stated that although all children weren't able to get access technology, whatever technology we had as a school, we gave it out to our children who were in temporary housing. We also gave it out to those children who were special needs because we knew that was the priority. The other thing that we did was create all of the backpacks that provided this support that the children would need at home, but we only did it up until April 20th. And they have just announced this past Saturday without notification to the schools that schools will be closed throughout all the way through June. So now we have to figure out what are we gonna do because there's still children without the technology. But as we always do, we will figure it out. For my team, I realized that they're in a place where they were holding it together. Many of them have lost family members literally living in their households next to them because they could not get them to the hospital. So what I did was we got a mental health provider that we've always had in our school because that's part of the culture of what we do. They are providing services for our team as a group. So our team gets to meet to just talk, to gain strategies, how to deal with grief, to gain strategies with just how to deal with frustration, so that they can be the best parent, because we forget educators are parents too. They're managing their children at home. They're trying to get their children on board and online. But most importantly, we had to do the same thing for our parents. Our parents who do not have the capacity sometimes to even manage their own children. Our parents who are dealing with loss themselves. So we've provided parent hour, parent chats that the mental health provider is doing on a weekly basis. We have parent conferences. So we have literally canceled out afternoons so that parents can meet with the teachers so that they can share their concerns.
Thank you so much for sharing, Nadia. I know that there's a lot of comments of it that say that the experience that you had is very similar to what they're having. You know, there's lots of relativity in terms of the experience. So I thank you for sharing that. I also wish to give you my condolences for your losses and pray for strength. I'm now very conscious of time. We're now going to be starting to run overtime, and we still have Armand to speak. And what I've asked Armand to do is to wrap up for us and to conclude this discussion. Those that need to go, need to go. But we have one surprise after Armand, where we have a teacher called Jimmy Rotherham, who is going to teach us a song. And so we'll end on that note. So please wait after Armand is finished, and we will have a more positive end to this call. I'm looking forward to Jimmy belting out some Ed Sheeran for us. Armand is a teacher in Canada. Armand has co-authored a paper recently with Koen, with Jimmy, on informing UNESCO and EI on how they should be thinking about pedagogy in this time. Armand, can you please say a few words, and please, if you don't mind, summarizing on Esteban and my behalf the call today.
I'll try, Vikas. I'm going to keep it at 5 minutes. I have another Zoom call that I got to get to with my students. So I've been on the last 2 calls as well. I'm going to summarize from a teacher perspective what we're seeing. First of all, this crisis response, teachers on the front lines that are in professional models, professional standards, high professional standards are doing quite well. You've heard David talk about it earlier in this call, but they've been able to pivot quite quickly. And can you hear me, Vikas?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm hearing some background. They've been able to do a great job. The ones that have more of an occupational model where it's a pretty scripted teacher that's in the classroom, and that the teaching standards are not at the same level, and austerity measures have pretty much brought down the teaching profession, are struggling at this point. So I'm going to approach it from 3 different things at the moment. Number 1 is the crisis response and how teachers were used. Across the board, across the world, teachers were not used as well as we could have been, particularly when school closures happened. Teachers are the ones that have the closest relationships with students, apart from their parents. We could have been used by the healthcare system in terms of communication to be able to practice physical distancing, reaching out to these families, getting that, disseminate that information, getting out that information as quickly as possible, but also making contact with our students very quickly. There's many systems across the world that have centralized that communication and that have told teachers not to communicate with their students right off the bat. And I think that's wrong, right from the start, in terms of a social emotional point of view, in terms of being able to send out the message that the population wants to hear and needs to hear from the healthcare perspective. So I think in terms of crisis response, that was a big gap that if we are going to have other shortages over the next, or other school closures over the next 12 months to 18 months, we should really think about teachers as first communicators and first responders in that sense. The second thing is, with this crisis, and I think Nadia really touched upon it, is the social programs and the equity issue needs to be addressed, and that's something that cannot be addressed by teachers and education. It can be addressed in partnerships, and teachers can be a part of that conversation, but realistically, the social programs need to be in place to address those basic needs of students have not been there. And on the 2 past calls, that's the same thing. You're looking at basic needs in terms of food. You're looking at basic needs in terms of shelter, child abuse, social programs in terms of maybe welfare and so on and so forth. Where the school plays that hub, we really need to look at it from a different lens. Learning as it happens now, I'm sorry to say, but from what I see, it's going to get to a certain level and teachers are doing the best they can, but without those social programs and without the professional development and capacity building, it's not going to get much better at this point. So we need to look at it from an emergency education's point of view where, okay, what are we going to do when we get back? And let's put our time and effort into that right now. So we've done the response, we're doing as best as we can, but let's allocate a lot of resources to look at what are we going to do when we're coming back? With 2 main principles. One is, can we build it back better? And can we do no harm? Because realistically, the equity gap is going to be wider when we get back. Students across the board are going to have some sort of gaps that they're dealing with. But as long as we take care of the social, emotional, and relationships, we're doing a good job. So one of those programs that I think should be put into place is, what kind of task force are you going to have, particularly in countries that have more of an occupational model to teaching and not a professional teaching standards, to make sure that those students come back. So those are partnerships that need to be created with social workers, with NGOs, with foundations, and you got to be knocking on everybody's door or finding them where they are and making sure that they come back to schools. That's a major issue that we need to be taking a look at the moment. Koen talked about blended learning and asynchronous and synchronous learning. I agree with that. And if you're looking at asynchronous, we got to push it to the next level and look at the different types of learning that you can do, because we treat pedagogy as and now we have these all-star pedagogies, but instead it's your toolbox. You use all of these pedagogies at the right time. So you have active-based learning, you got blended learning, you got collaborative and cooperative learning, you got experiential learning, guided discovery learning, inquiry-based, problem-based, project-based learning. And all these learning styles can be put into place in the design for online learning, for asynchronous or synchronous learning in that view. But we can't do that right now. And we have to have the lens of it for long term. So I think what we're seeing in the call today and what we're seeing across the board is, one, we need to have social programs put into place. And we need to really think about how are we going to get that equity gap closed. And then the second thing is building on the teacher capacity and the professional development of teachers to make sure that the professional standards are high so that we can address the issues as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Armand. And we will end with a song, like I said. But before we end, a huge thank you to all our speakers. I'd like to encourage them all to post their comments on the LinkedIn group, not just on this chat group, because then we can have a discussion, a threaded discussion. So can I please ask all the speakers to go to the LinkedIn site and just put in their basic points that they made so that everyone can reflect on those further.
Sorry, before the song, so we finish with the song. Through Nadia, I wanted to thank everyone. We know these are very stressful days for all of you. And so that's why we really appreciate that you share your experiences, your feelings and your emotions, because I think it makes this whole meeting a much more fruitful one. So Nadia, my condolences to you and your community, and to all of you, knowing that you're going through very stressful times. Thank you very much for sharing. We hope that this coming together will help us all go through them in a much better way. So that's the first goal we have. And I think to that point, I think it's a good way to finish with that song. So go ahead, Vikas.
Over to Jimmy Rotherham. Jimmy, we're yours.
Thank you, guys. I hope this is a really nice surprise for you all, because it's a really big surprise for me, because I wasn't expecting this. So I thought it was a nice song to finish with. And this is just to all of you to say thank you for getting your heads together and trying to come up with some solutions.
Last गाना चांद शौके करते बोले थे सुनो ना.
What would you think if I sang out a tune Would you stand up and walk out on me? Lend me your ears and I'll sing you a song. And I'll try not to sing out of key. I get by with a little help from my friends. I'm gonna try with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends. What do I do when my school is closed down? Does it worry me to be alone? How do I feel by the end of the day? Am I sad because I'm on my own? No, I get by with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends. I'm gonna try with a little help from my friends. Do I need anybody? I just need someone to love. Could it be anybody? No, it's gotta be global education experts and funky teacher ambassadors and big cash as well. Oh, I get by with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends. I'm gonna try with a little help from my friends.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank all of our speakers, Jimmy, for their contribution today and for sharing. And we look forward to seeing you all on the LinkedIn group. Thank you and goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these very wonderful women.
Love you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Thank
you.
Thank you very much.